introduce myself. My name is Sahil Bansal. I'm a lawyer, work with Trilegal, and I've been working for the last 7 years into the sphere of white-collar investigations, audits, advising companies throughout, international, national, public companies on how to conduct an effective, internal investigation. Have been doing some internal investigations for them and advising them on various legal aspects into liabilities, board liabilities, disclosure obligations, etc. So I'm going to speak about the legal contours of a forensic audit, what it means from a legal lens and how it is different, just to give a flavor from a pure accounting side, and as a lawyer, how we perceive it and how it matters to the authorities. So these are the very recent news clippings. I just wanted to portray it because it shows that how regulators are very interested in getting forensic audits done. Just to give you an example, we have seen a lot of actions in the public companies where specifically SEBI has asked for forensic audits, and it's not a recent trend. I guess it's quite long when SEBI has asked for forensic audits. They have themselves conducted forensic audits. Apart from that, we have seen a trend where the investors, because of their investor rights under the transaction documents, mostly the shareholders, they have asked for the forensic audits to be done on an investee company. So the reason that why I want you to look into this slide is because you will see the requirements of a forensic audit is being pressed upon by every stakeholder, be it a regulator, be it an investor, be it the management of the company, or when there are potential disputes between the promoters. So this comes handy, and it's important to know what forensic audit means from a legal sense. There are certain guidelines by SEBI which specifically says what forensic audit is, and in fact there are some FAQs published where they say that forensic audit will only amount to whenever an audit is conducted for finding some discrepancies in the financial statements or siphoning of money or any financial impropriety. Now, it's very important to understand that why the sphere of forensic audit is limited by SEBI. And this is the guidance which is being taken by the other regulators as well. See, just to give you an example, that there may be some process audits which may require looking into financials, but materially, it may not fall into the bracket of a forensic audit. And this has wide implications. When we say the term, if we construe it in a very liberal sense, it may amount a lot of problems for the public companies in these days. So for example, just to give you an example, there was a public company for whom we were conducting an internal investigation. There were some allegations of bribery and siphoning off of money by the management. So we divided the investigation into two parts. One was essentially a preliminary investigation. It was a whistleblower, pursuant to a whistleblower, we were doing that. Now, we divided that into two parts. First part was we thought that we would conduct a preliminary investigation, and if we found something, we will move on to the other ones. Now, this was a public company, and the procedures that we adopted during the preliminary investigation, the question on those procedures were, would they amount to a public disclosure to the stock exchanges? Now, that's where the definition of a forensic audit would come handy. Because in your initial investigation, if you are not materially looking into any financial statement frauds, or any frauds that you can comprehend would lead to a change or revision in the financial statements, that would not be amounted to any forensic audit. And by that logic, which the regulators have also accepted over the years, that, that if you conduct a preliminary investigation just to understand whether the issues exist at a prima facie level, that will not amount to a stock exchange disclosure. And this is the approach that most of the public companies have been taking these days. They can assess the merits of a whistleblower of a whistleblower at a prima facie level and understand whether they require a public disclosure to the stock exchanges or not. So In our experience of conducting forensic audits, I think we can divide it broadly into 2 to 3 spheres. One are the ones which, at the face of it, from the complaint that would require some sort of financial data scrutiny. For instance, if a whistleblower comes where they have blatantly alleged that money has been paid, let's say by the management of the company or by the employees of the company to public officials, now that cannot be done without looking into the transactions. You have to do thorough transaction testing. Then there would be interviews. There may be review of the electronically stored information. So that is very blatantly fall into the scrutiny of the financial statements or books and accounts of the company. The other one, which we have understood in our practice, would pertain to your cyber frauds, where essentially you would need to scrutinize the system, but that would also look into the practices that you adopt. So there are certain guidelines by the government which says what sort of reasonable practices you need to implement in your company to prevent such kind of frauds. There were some rules. Now the new act is coming, DPDP Act for data privacy. But if I talk about the previous domain of legislations which are still applicable, these are the SPDI rules published by the government in 2012, which talk about you need to have reasonable security practices within your company. So one domain of the audits would be on cybersecurity. The third one would fall into the category of other residuary audits, for example, the HR audits and the process audits, which are typically not considered forensic audits by the regulators as well. So if I have to carve out 3 main buckets, I think these 3 would be the one, and the first bucket that I talk about would essentially contain the forensic audits. Okay, now, what sort of legal framework are we looking to undertake this forensic audit? I think it's very important, because even if, let's say, a pure chartered accountant is undertaking a forensic audit, would that be considered appropriate enough by the authorities so that, if an evidence is found at this stage, can that be presented in a court of law if the matter turns contentious? That's the issue that we face a lot. And there have been guidelines and there have been, practices that are being followed to ensure that whatever evidence you gather from a forensic audit, that is useful if to be produced in a court of law. And not from that perspective, I think, so just to give you an example. So let's say if during the forensic audit, during the electronically stored information review, an email is found where one employee is saying that, yes, we need to pay this much amount of money to public officials, and it is flagged in the audit and it comes before the investigator. Now it's important that it is preserved in a manner that it cannot be disregarded in a court of law, or if any employment action is taken against that person, that evidence should stand good. To that, what can be done? Now, there are laws which talk about how you should preserve it, how you should conduct an forensic audit from a legal lens. Firstly, I'll talk about what the law is around the conduct of the audit and where it comes from. So one is the basic provisions of the Companies Act, which talk about certain auditor responsibility under 143(12), where under their procedures found any fraud, and fraud is also a defined term under the Act, then they need to report it to the central government if the quantum exceeds 1 crore. But if the quantum is less than 1 crore, then they have to report it to the board or the management, as the case may be. That's precisely, the Companies Act sums it up, your obligation to disclose. Now, there are other acts which also talk about how you should report a fraud to various agencies, like PMLA, Prevention of Money Laundering Act, talks about the sharing of information with FIU. And then there are regulations from the market regulators like RBI, which talks about mandatory forensic audits in certain situations. For example, when the amount of the allegation talks about a certain kind of frauds, and if the fraud amount which is being figured out in the forensic audit exceeds a specific limit, then it's bound to disclosures as well to the RBI. Lastly, we have a broad legislation in India which also talks about, which doesn't provide any provisions for conducting any effective forensic audit if you face an issue, but I think there is an arguable case which can be made from the reading of Prevention of Corruption Act. Just to give you an example and a very practical thing to implement, let's say if any bribery scheme is going on in a company, right? And during the audit, if it is figured out that yes, from a reasonable standard, more likely than not, bribe has been paid. Now, what to do? And is there any mitigation which can be done at this stage? The answer to that question is yes, the company can still mitigate these factors from a legal standpoint. So for example, at that point in time, if appropriate remediations are used, it may be considered by the court as a mitigating factor. And if I specifically talk about, there is a provision in Prevention of Corruption Act which talks about if you implement adequate procedures, then your mitigation can be curbed. It is a defense even for a corporation to not be prosecuted in case their employees are involved in a bribe scheme. So the mere factum of initiating a forensic audit and applying remediation post that would or may, in this case, because this has not been tested out in India at least. We can take it after this. Yeah. So what I was saying, that it is fine for the companies at that point in time to initiate forensic audits and then apply remediation just as to create the defense of adequate procedures. Though it has not been tested in the Indian courts yet, it's still a foreign phenomenon. We have taken it from the UK Bribery Act, but still it holds some value, at least if this is to be tested in a court of law and an arguable case could be made. Okay, now on the disclosure requirements pursuant to a forensic audit, one is definitely under the Companies Act that I talked about. 143(12) talk about the reporting to be made to the central government if the fraud amount exceeds 1 crore. Apart from that, there are CARO obligations where any fraud on the company or by the company has to be reported in the annual report or the auditor reports, which would form a part of the annual report. Apart from that, every whistleblower that the company receives, pursuant to which an audit could be claimed, that is also required to be reported. And it's very important because in these days, a lot of the the auditors' practices that we have seen, that they ask for the management reps, and these are extensive management reps, and where they will talk about had there been any fraud in the company for the last 3 years or so, or for the required period, and it's the obligation of the company to report to that. And in case they find that, we have seen a lot of examples where appropriate management reps are not given, or they see discrepancy in the management reps vis-a-vis the actual practice in a company, the auditors tend to resign. And that's a big reputational risk for the company, especially if you are a public company, because that would amount to a public disclosure to the stock exchanges, right? So I think these disclosure requirements are also very important to understand, mostly from forensic audit perspective, as to where to disclose and when to disclose. Apart from that, there are obligations on the company to disclose the factum of initiation of a forensic audit to stock exchanges. So just to give you an example, if there is a public company which is about to initiate a forensic audit, are they or are they not under an obligation to disclose it to the stock exchanges so that the shareholders could know? The answer is yes. The company needs to disclose this fact of initiation of the audit to the stock exchanges. But there is a catch that the buck doesn't only stop there. Then they need to also provide, the redacted copies of the report. And we have seen this, that the redacted copies of the reports, forensic audit reports, that have also been shared with the stock exchange, and eventually they were made public. So that's a big risk that the organizations are also running. Bigger risk is if you don't disclose, then what is the consequence? The consequence is that the regulator can tell you to initiate a forensic audit separately, which they would supervise. And we have seen this in many cases where the regulators have initiated the forensic audits on their own, or they have asked the companies to appoint the professional investigators to get the matter investigated. Prevention of Money Laundering Act, I think from a disclosure obligations perspective, we have already talked about. There are certain kind of transactions for a separate set of companies that they need to report to. For example, cash transactions over a specific limit, they are required to be reported to the FIU. Suspicious transactions, which which they call the reporting entities, and reporting entities would mean the more sensitive entities. I have to put it in the layman term. They also need to require certain suspicious transactions to the FIU. So I think disclosure obligations are something we need to understand from a perspective that once a forensic audit is being initiated, it is not only a function of having a finding. There are a lot of other things that run parallelly. Those other things could be your reporting, starting from your reporting to the local police and then to all the way to the regulator and to their shareholders. And this is all about external shareholders. Then the problem would come when a company, let's say a private company, have some clauses in their transaction documents which talk about that investors would have a special right to see if any investigation is going on. And we have seen these cases where the investors do have some special rights on any investigation being run in the company, and then the company would bound to be disclosed to the investors. I would also want to discuss one important thing here, I think from a lawyer's perspective and from a CA's perspective, that there is a concept of having attorney-client privilege. So for example, if we run an investigation or a forensic audit for any client, we enter into an engagement letter and our whole engagement is protected by the attorney-client privilege. Now, what does that mean? And how does it benefit a client? And whenever we work, let's say with a pure accounting firm, in terms of getting the forensic audits done, we tend to enter into certain agreements, for example, a tripartite agreement between a lawyer, company, and the forensic accountants, which will extend that privilege to the accountants as well. The way it works in a practical life is, for example, if any authority asks me to produce a document being a lawyer, let's say if I have conducted some forensic audit for a client, and if any authority asks me that, yes, you need to produce this document, I can very well refuse and say that it is protected by the attorney-client privilege and I can't produce it. And that's the protection given to me by the Indian Evidence Act and now Bharatiya Sakshaya Adhiniyam, right? Unfortunately, this kind of privilege does not exist when we talk about CAs, because the privilege is not recognized under law. So there is a difference of situation. Let's say when an authority asks a CA or a chartered accountant specifically if you need to produce the documents to the authorities, if you are conducting a forensic investigation, under law they are bound to produce that. But then there are ways, creative ways as to how this could be stopped. CA firms can generally enter into an engagement with lawyers or a law firm, a joint engagement with the client, and that's how a tripartite agreement is created and the legal privilege is extended to the CA. So I think these are the combinations that we have seen in the market from a practical perspective as to how legal protection is given to a forensic audit, that even if a finding is coming up, there are ways to not unnecessarily disclose it to the third parties which may or may not be interested in that forensic audit. So we have already talked about these forensic audits. Now, disclosure requirements, I think more or less we have covered. We have understood in terms of both private and public companies what are the major requirements. Now, as you would have noticed that the domain of forensic audits in relation to what offenses it can come up with has also been changed with the advent of the new laws. The 3 new criminal laws have been passed by the Indian government very recently, and there are various offenses that have come up. So, for example, if an audit finding comes that yes, there has been some siphoning of money by the employees of the company, right? Now, with this, there are certain thresholds of law that needs to be fulfilled. So, one thing that we have seen in the practice that if we understand that what potential offense it might trigger, it may be easy for us to understand what we should look for. Just to give you an example, the standard of proof in Indian law to prove an offense is beyond reasonable doubt. And beyond reasonable doubt, when I say it means that if I am presenting, let's say, 99 arguments in favor of a fraud being committed, and if someone is saying that there is only one argument which can demolish my theory, the court will tend to say that yes, this has not been committed because you have not proven beyond reasonable doubt. I think that's a very simple explanation of it. But if at the time of conducting forensic audit, we know what are the requirements of the law, that how to prove that beyond reasonable doubt standard, and from that perspective we undertake that forensic audit, I think that would be really helpful in terms of collating all the ingredients of an offense. So what we have seen in our practice is, let's say for the mere offense of bribery being provided by the let's say management of a company to public officials. And let's say if a finding comes, if an email comes, or let's say if you come across a financial transaction which says, which does not provide the origin of the money and where it goes. Let's say a third-party contractor is being hired and the company pays to a third-party contractor without taking any invoice, and then it is suppose that that third-party contractor would have paid to the public official. Would that be sufficient to prove the case in a court of law? The answer would be no. Right? Even though we have a finding, we may find it difficult to prove it in a court of law. Now, what to do in those cases? I think this is something that has been added up over the years to, in the practice of having forensic audits done, that what are the other constituents apart from having a finding, let's say from an electronic review of the information, or from purely from an accounting testing, right? And in those cases, just expanding on the example, like, what else could be done to prove that offense of bribery in a court of law? One thing would be to gather evidence to have some sort of intention from an employee. So for example, if we are looking for any information, any electronically stored information, the emails of individuals which say that yes, money has been paid, we should also focus on having some sort of intention on the part of that employee which could prove that yes, money has been paid for this purpose, right? So that would add up your actors, which is the act, with the intention, which is the malified. And when they both club together, I think it's easy to prove an offense when it goes to a court of law. And not only in the court of law, I think when an internal disciplinary action is being taken against the company, though the standard is much lower, but if we have that threshold of evidence, I think it's very easy for negotiate for the company, with these employees to resign, or to resign on a favorable term, to enter into various non-disparagement, non-compete clauses. And, it's a sort of arm twisting tactic for the companies as well. But I think if this approach is followed where the evidence threshold in a forensic audit comes high, then it's very easy to negotiate terms with the outgoing employees. Okay. Okay, so there is a thumb rule on the electronic evidence that every evidence in electronic form can be admissible in a court of law, provided that it passes the muster, right? And there are certain tests laid down in the Indian Evidence Act and now Bharatiya Sakshya Adhiniyam, which is the new law, which says that first of all, so just to give you an example, if you talk about WhatsApp, so let's say in your WhatsApp there is some evidence and you need to prove it in a court of law. What you need to do, you would need to have, so there are two ways you can present this evidence. One, you take your phone to the court and tell this to the court that this is going to be the exhibit and this is my primary evidence. The court would accept the phone, you're subject to various, conditions in the act, but generally the court would accept the phone and that would be treated as an evidence, the entire phone which contains your WhatsApp. The other way is you treat your WhatsApp data as a secondary evidence. And for that secondary evidence, you need to produce a certificate. Earlier, it used to be called 65B certificate under the old act. Now, the requirements under that, under the new law has changed. You need to provide a certificate that yes, this device is being used on daily purpose, on a reasonable ground, and there have been no manipulations in that. And an expert would have to sign that, filling in details as to how you have extracted this data. Have there been any manipulations in extracting that data? So one form is to be filled by a party, the other form is to be filled by an expert along with that evidence, and then it is to be produced. But the thumb rule remains, if you are able to fulfill these conditions, the data can be produced in a court of law. Just because it's in WhatsApp doesn't mean that it cannot be produced.
But that may be debatable in the court.
Yes.
Whether it is genuine or not.
Yes. So we have seen generally in case of phones which are very easy to carry, that can be produced as a primary evidence, right? The problem comes, let's say, where you have extracted an email and email comes from a server and you can't carry the whole server to the court, right? There, the conditions are quite, egregious, where you need to produce the whole data as a secondary evidence, not as a primary evidence. So that's how, sorry, can't hear you. Yes. Yep. This is. I'm saying that there will be hassle of producing another set of documentation, right? With the secondary evidence, you need to provide essentially what used to be called a 65B, right? But with the primary evidence, there are no such requirements. So it's very easy to carry a phone. Let's say if this is my phone is having that one. Yes. 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 Yes, it is. It is. But nevertheless, this has to be given with a certificate. Yes. Yes. Exactly. It would, it would, it would, it would. And that's precisely because of the reason when you talk about, let's say, if an email is carved out, right? And it's very difficult or impossible to get the entire server shifted to the court, right? Can't be a primary evidence, but now the recent law has stated that you still need to give a certificate for that, and that's why two set of certificates, one by the expert, the other one by the party. And if I have to tell you why it is more egregious than the previous regime, if you look into the previous regime, there were no requirements of putting that hash value, IAM-EDE value. Now it is being mandatory that you need to provide all these data, right, with the proper form of custody, chain of custody. And only if all these requirements are fulfilled, then only the court would be under an obligation, or I would say the court may admit it, right, as compared to the previous regime where all these requirements were not there, right? So I completely agree that in this time it can be admitted to the court, but again, to the question of, sir asked in relation to WhatsApp data could be admitted, yes, it could be admitted as a primary evidence. You submit your phone and get away with this. If you want to submit it as a secondary data, you still have to provide those two certificates with all those details going down.
Sahil, I have one question. Like, we are working on various audits all through the years. Now, investigative agency comes and say that you provide this data, which belongs to 10 years back. Now, what is the legal standing we should take? Because we don't have that data.
Yep.
Now, what is the standing we should take, and how we can move ahead on that side?
Okay. So for time period, I think this is the exact situation we have come across in one case where they asked about data from 2007. Last year this happened. I think we can simply refuse it, sir, because even if I see the Companies Act, I am not under an obligation to preserve that data for more than 7 years, and the Income Tax Act is also limited to 8 years to certain documents, right? Obviously, there are certain documents which are to be maintained for eternity. But if I talk about specifically about, the documents that are typically involved in a forensic audit, for instance, invoices or your emails, you are not under an obligation to maintain it for eternity. So if the data is quite dated, you can simply refuse it saying that this is not my legal obligation to preserve it and I don't have it. And this is the stance that we have taken in a lot of investigations also.
But Sahil, regulator does not means they don't accept this excuse, because if see, I have seen one case where there is a change in management of the company. The company has been taken over by another group, and after that SFIU came into picture. So they are asking for the data for 10 years back. So it is difficult for the new management to provide the data. And now regulator is not accepting their excuse.
Sure, I think okay, so even though the regulator is not accepting this, I think the worst case scenario, if we talk about what would happen, right? If you do not provide them with data, ultimately it would go to an adjudicatory authority that they have not. And there you have a valid legal defense to say that I am under no obligation to preserve this, and that's why I don't have it. Had there been any obligation on me to preserve this data, I would have had it. So if they ask me for the data for, let's say, past 3 years, which I am under an obligation to maintain, I will provide it, right? And you know, we have seen in some instances where people have actually tried to destroy the data, right? Just to use this defense. I don't think that's a good strategy, because ultimately that may, bound you in an offense which is called destruction of evidence. But if you don't have it, and even if the regulator doesn't listen, I think it's a valid defense in court to say the regulator will push for data, nevertheless. But if the matter turns contentious and ultimately it's being decided by an adjudicatory authority, you have a valid legal defense, sir. Perfectly fine.
See, as we have seen that, NIRC, I think they were also telling us that investigation goes for 10 years back also.
Yes.
But under law, we are not under compulsion to the documents for 10 years back. So there should be some representation from the big firms who is doing the forensic to the regulator. They should amend the law for this?
They should for this. And I think on this point, I would also want to talk about, certain practices which are being adopted in the other jurisdictions. So if you see most of the enforcement actions from the US agencies, specifically talking about SEC and DOJ, there is a fundamental difference of how they operate in India, the agencies operate in India. But under, I think, the US authorities do take certain permissions from, or, if I have to say it in the Indian parlance, warrants from their courts to get the data and, to search the premises for the older data. So that's an option available to the Indian authorities as well. So for example, if they ask you for data 10 years back, you don't provide it, they have the right to do search and seizure on the company, right? Now I understand that you are not under an obligation, but if the data they find out, they will take it away. There is an amendment required, that is for sure, but for that I think there are a lot of other things which are required to be improved. Just to give you an example, and a fundamental difference between the jurisdictions, and you will appreciate it because, we are working as of now on a lot of, FCPA disclosures at this point in time. What happens is, in India, you don't give the data. Regulators come, sometimes they also threaten, right? Use means. People tend to provide the data by that mean. Regulators use it in the court, the proceedings happen and adverse orders come against you. That's the sort of flow. If this has to happen in US, this doesn't work. Because if the regulator obtains the data by any means which are not within 4 bounds of law, the data will not be accepted in a court of law, right? And that's precisely we call the doctrine of fruits of poisonous tree in India, which is not applicable, right? So they say that, you must have seen a lot of sting operations also, and the CDs of those sting operations are being produced in a court of law. Had there been any other jurisdiction apart from India, that data would not have been permissible in a court of law. But in India, it is. So I think with all the changes that we require in terms of, the data, should be available for more than a certain threshold, specifically for investigations, I think we also require parallel amendments into the laws where, let's say, if data is not being taken by legal means, or I would say with consent, can that be produced in a court of law? The answer, unfortunately, is yes, but I think that should also be amended in a parallel way.
Thank you.
It's the expert, sir. It's an IT expert can also give. Yes, it shouldn't be any sort of designated experts. An IT expert who is in the keep of that particular device, they can also give. No, they are not. But the government will check that how they are claiming that they are the experts. So what we have seen that while issuing this certificate, the internal IT department of the company can also give that certificate. That yes, we have seen that. Because the reason for that is to be an expert, you should have the knowledge of that specific field. Plus the device should be in your possession for a certain amount of time. So for example, if they are looking into the servers, right? The IT department is in understanding of how they work and they can also produce this one. Obviously, the court will test it out who the experts are. It's not like a pure lawyer could give it, but on a reasonable basis, they accept that yes, who can give it.
Sahil, just one question. What major precaution we should take while finalizing the forensic audit reports for the court of law? Because what we are seeing nowadays is the forensic audit reports are not accepted or they have some issues. So what exactly from the legal perspective we should take care of in the forensic audit reports?
I think one very important thing to have this in forensic audit reports is to have some sort of tripartite with a lawyer or a law firm. And this is important from a strategic perspective to extend the attorney-client privilege to forensic audit reports as well. That's one. Two, I think from the management side as to how to deliver that report, from a very practical perspective, I'm telling you, let's say if you are preparing a report and you send it to a client over email, and let's say if any regulator searches through the inboxes of certain employees and they figure your forensic audit report and take it into account, I think certain measures should be taken that you don't store that into the servers of the company, right? So for example, you could create a link which you can share with them and don't give them the reading rights provided that they don't want it or what kind of arrangement you are into. But I think the major custodian of that report should be you, unless or until it is being explicitly asked by any stakeholder in the company, so as to prevent the sort of flow to external third parties, right? So I think these two things along with certain mitigation measures, I would say the more reduction of names to the extent required, and not to create unnecessary physical copies. We can give the instructions to the client as well. So I think this is the basic hygiene checks that we have seen in terms of how to protect the client's interest as well as our interest in terms of drafting a report.
Also, I like to add to it. There are many discrete findings of discrete investigations in forensic audit.
Yes.
For example, the statements of witnesses when you are interviewing them, throw of evidence.
Yep.
Okay, so I'll restart. So,
Yep.
to Sir's question, and this is a very important question, I was actually about to have investigation reports which have to be admissible in the court of law. So from experience, and there are some, of course, loopholes. First of all, there is a particular format. In this format, the discrete investigation findings should not be part of the final dossier which goes to the police or which goes to the agency. Secondly, these reports, as you rightly said, the chain of custody has to be rightly preserved. Nowhere should the agencies conflict with the private investigators or the forensic auditors and find this report and lest it, jeopardizes the whole process.
Yes.
Number three, the whole process of whether you are preparing a civil suit for damages or whether you are preparing a police complaint, how you are converting the findings of this report, a very formal report, into say 2 or 3 page police complaint or say 20, 30 page civil suit is where the entire game lies. We have seen by experience, you do a comprehensive investigation, discreet as well as overt, you go with a report, you go to the police, and police is not able to understand a single word of it.
Yes.
Which is, of course, expected.
Yes.
But then you are supposed to explain to them what happened. So I think most of the game lies in telling them exactly what has happened, linking it to the punishable offense in the IPC or BNS, of course, explaining them, and nothing else in the report or the complaint. And one major thing, the loss has to be made out.
Yes.
Whatever you are doing, there is a loss to the company. Whether there is a fraud that has happened or whether there is some misconduct which has happened, or anything, it is resulting in some loss. The computation of loss has to be very clear, whether it's a civil suit, whether it is a police action, SFIO, ED, whatever. So these are some of the things which I could think of, of course, if you would like to add from the law firm's perspective.
So I think there is one important consideration, and there may be that report or any of its finding apart from the client and any of the stakeholders that the client would want us to share with, that is not shared with any person, including any excerpts from the report with the police, and there is a reason for that. We talked about attorney-client privilege. Unfortunately, the situation in India is that if you waive your privilege, it's over. Limited waiver of privilege is not allowed. And just to give an example, let's say I issue a report to a client, providing all the findings, annexures, whatever I have seen from the electronically stored information or from interviews. The report is with the client. Can the client share the findings with the police or let's say the regulators on their own on a voluntary basis? The answer from a very legal perspective might be no. The reason for that is the moment the client shares it with any third party, and I would say any third party, the waiver is off, right? And then once the waiver is off, then your report or the findings are not protected, right? And once you waive this waiver, and once you waive this, you cannot claim back again that, yeah, we have, waived it for a limited purpose. We were just trying to share the findings with the police only. We will not share it with anyone. So how we have tackled this situation is, let's say we have the reports. We prepare a very short, crisp summary for the police, or we tend to brief them orally, ki, yes, we have seen this, and these are the major findings. If you want to convert it into a, let's say, daily diary report or a FIR, you're more than willing to do it. But if we share any of our excerpts from the report, it will be difficult for us to assert privilege again on that. So I think that's a slightly different approach that we take in a law firm as compared to, let's say, for pure, forensic audit report is being given by accounting firm. Yes. Exactly. 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 I think that's a more safer approach, I would say, in terms of how to present the evidence. And one thing is that internal investigation is being done by us. That's fine. But police may or may not rely on it. They have to do their own complete investigation. And even if we have stated that, yes, money has been paid and all, by a company, the police may or may not accept it, right? So their investigation will start where our investigation ends, right? And that's the approach. I think if we tell them that this is a matter of fact that we have seen, then police can further build it on if they can provide the essential, or if they can come up with certain essential ingredients of the offenses, if they are being fulfilled, and they will try to build their case from that perspective. May not be may not be perspective from a forensic auditor's, eyes. Okay, so ED essentially looks into two kinds of acts. One is Prevention of Money Laundering Act, and the other one is for the FEMA violations. Now, we don't talk about the FEMA violations here because that's a separate sphere, but essentially in case of PMLA, the role of ED kicks in, and how it kicks in, let's say an FIR is being filed against a company or certain set of individuals. The day an FIR is filed, and if that offense is being scheduled in the PMLA as a predicate offense, ED has the jurisdiction to come, search and seizure, file an ECIR, which is akin to what an FIR is.
So he automatically appointed or appointed by the central government?
I'm sorry?
To take action.
I'm sorry?
ED. ED came into the picture while this PMLA, under PMLA. So whose direction it give the search? Whose direction? By central government appoint this?
Okay, ED has the central government has the jurisdiction over ED. It's not a state police. Now, if, let's say, you come up with a scenario where any fraud is being committed and various authorities are involved. So, just to give you an example how it works, if there is a FIR of, let's say, fraud and bribe being paid by a company to a public official, the jurisdiction would be of the state police and the CBI. What we have seen that CBI has generally taken into account because of their white powers and the special act they come under. And after that, once an offense is established, or let's say an FIR is being filed by the police or the CBI, the thumb rule is that a predicate offense is created. Now ED can come in. Both the investigation agencies have separate powers to conduct search and seizure. CBI can come, take your record, and then ED can come. It's not like both the authorities would have to come jointly or they work in tandem. They do, but their powers are separate under various acts.
So there is no differences or different the confusion which authority should come into the picture first?
I think from an acts perspective, from an offense perspective, no, because CBI will look into different offenses. In the very example that I gave you, if there is a charge of, let's say, fraud and bribery, CBI will essentially book you under Prevention of Corruption Act and for the offenses under IPC, erstwhile IPC, now there is a new name for that. But the ED will eventually charge you under Section 3 and Section 4 of the PMLA, right? And the purpose, the tenor of all these offenses are different, so they are bound to take their evidence independently. Though they collaborate, they share evidence, we have seen this in a lot of cases, but the actions could be quite different from both the authorities. Sure.
Other questions from any of the member?
You meant stakeholders of a company to have enough preemptive and protective measures so that tomorrow in the court of law, the mitigation factor can be there. Fine. Does a company which has a sound business code of conduct, like many of the MNCs which have it, fall under this ambit as to the court of law can consider that since you have a business code of law, okay, a code of conduct, sorry, that will itself be sufficient for the mitigation factor against a director, for example?
Okay, so I think the answer could act as a defense from the prosecution. Now, what these adequate procedures are, these are not defined by the Indian legislation. There is no case law on that. There is no judicial pronouncement. So the question comes, how do we understand it? What do they entail? I think one interpretation could be taken from the UK Bribery Act of 2010, where we have taken this defense from. And they have talked about six-pronged principle as to what you should have in your company so that you can tell the court or the judicial authorities that yes, we have those quote-unquote adequate procedures.
Also from FCPA?
Yes, from an FCPA perspective, but we have taken this language of adequate procedure, which is more closer to UKBA. Right? That's why I mentioned UKBA, and the same law has been passed in Singapore, I think, a couple of months back also. Now, when you talk about that, the mere factum of having supplier code of conduct, or let's say having an internal code of conduct for the employees, would it suffice? Yes, but it's only one of the factors, right? The other factors, just to give you an example, do you have regular training sessions within your company? Do you have requisite internal controls within your company? I'm talking about financial controls.
Whistleblower policy.
Whistleblower policies, yes. Not only whistleblower, then there are other plethora of policies which have been mentioned. Now you talk about FCPA, they provide you with a list of policies what you should have in your company. Same goes with FCPA. Same goes with UKBA and the recent Singapore law. Now apart from that, even if you have the supplier code of conduct, do your employees understand it? Or do they have access to it? All these factors are taken into account, by the UK courts as of now to adjudge whether or not you have the adequate procedures. But unfortunately, we haven't seen this jurisprudence in India. But our hunches and how we advise our client is that you should have a very comprehensive internal controller compliance management program, so that when push comes to shove, and if you have to provide this defense to the court, you can say that even if you follow this 6-prong principle given in the UK Bribery Act, you are still fulfilled, and that's the only relevant guidance that you could find at that point in time, and you have fulfilled with it.
So which means that this is discretionary to a large extent, right?
I think at this point in time, I would not say it's discretionary. I think there is no clarity, right? And to be on the conservative side, if we have some guidance from some international laws which gives us enough clarity, I think we should follow that. Because ultimately, if there is no jurisprudence, the court, in order to derive that jurisprudence, they will also look into what international practice is.
Right.
And then we can say that, yes, we are already abiding by the international practice, and that's why we are presenting that defense.
Fine, thanks for this. And on a separate note, and totally a practical aspect, practical question, if during an interview, as part of an investigation, immediately after you interview the suspect, he resigns, and I'm not talking about a listed company, say a private limited company, okay? And this is one common scenario which I think you would appreciate happens. Yep. Being a lawyer, what would you do if you are on behalf of the client interviewing if you are in the investigation team?
So if an employee resigns, he resigns. You can't bound him, and there is a reason for that. If I talk about purely on a contractual term, can I stop someone from resigning? The answer would be no. Under the Contract Act.
My question is more from the perspective of when you are taking this case to the court of law and you're preparing your report and making your dossier, would resigning just after an interview be a kind of an corroborative or circumstantial evidence to prove, the charge?
I don't think that's a corroborative evidence, because there may be a case that the employee doesn't want to face that hassle. We have seen that, because even though if you interview certain innocent employee, I would say the employees who work on ground, right? Someone is getting 10K as a monthly payment, and they are being made to sit an interview of 12-hour long, 13-hour long interviews happening. And if they resign, the court do take into consideration, if the matter turns contentious, that it's not because of any guilt or because of any potential action that they assume they are resigning. It may simply be because of any hassle. So I think it's a very neutral perspective.
But what if there is enough evidence
Sahil,
in terms of
sorry
digital
to intervene.
evidence?
I think, are you done with your presentation or it's still left?
I think it's done.
So what we can do, a lot of one-to-one is happening. Sure. We can have the public query, sure, and then we can break for a lunch. Sure. And then you can discuss your queries,
sure.
Of the dais.
Sure.
यार ये हर बार आप लोगों को क्यों कहना पड़ता है कि माइक दे दो कोई क्वेरी पूछ रहे तो?
With the UK laws,
yes.
US laws and European Union laws.
Yes.
But a vendor who's signing it here, he has no idea. So don't we have they're forcing everybody to sign blindly, yes, till they get the contract. But what I'm saying is we have a law which combines all those laws and which is applicable to India, because we don't come under we are not under their control.
Yes.
So, but they are forcing everybody to sign. Despite of that law is not applicable in India.
Exactly. So the answer to that question is why the companies are being made to sign these agreements with vendors is because of the extraterritorial application of these laws. If I talk about in UK, it's the UKBA, which imposes certain extraterritorial obligations. Just to give you an example, let's say if you have a subsidiary in India and have a parent in the US, and if the subsidiaries' accounts are ultimately consolidated into the parent, and the parent is either an issuer or the resident there, then if any fraud happens within India, the company in the US or in the UK may be prosecuted. And that's how these laws work. And to mitigate that, they would want the subsidiaries or the associates in India to enter into certain mitigation measures. One of the reasons is to enter into these compliance agreements with the vendors. Unfortunately, in India, there is no law. But because you face a potential risk vis-a-vis your parent in the UK or the US, you're bound to sign it.
They are not enforceable in India because
they are not.
Yeah,
they are not. But the parent entity in the US or UK will suffer.
For the vendor, he can also take them to.
They are not.
They are not take them to court. Either you have a law.
Sir, my request. So, आपने speaker का view सुन लिया. Let's avoid one-to-one. We enter into a more discussion rather than.
I'm asking. See, so there is no law, so they're forced to, without knowing it, they're signing.
Yes, that's the unfortunate situation.
So I think we are done. Let's have a big round of applause for our speaker, Sahil. And let me say, so, Kunal was supposed to come and he got viral in the morning. He was not well. Sahil is working with Kunal. So Kunal called Sahil. Sahil, can you go on my behalf? So extremely short notice of maybe 3 hours.
Yes.
And you delivered well. Thanks Sahil for joining us. Let's have once over a round of applause for Sahil.